Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today we're having an episode that's a little different from the ones that I typically host. It's an episode where we're going to talk about cooking waterfowl. Maybe we will touch on some other types of wild game, but we're not going to be having as a guest necessarily a professional chef as we have had on some previous episodes, which I think makes this one particularly exciting. Our guest today is Michel DeVink, the Manager of National Conservation Planning for Ducks Unlimited Canada. Jean-Michel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. And you got the pronunciation of my name spot on. So thanks for that. I typically go by JM for folks if it's easier than that. So thanks for having me on.
This is an idea that you actually brought to me, I guess maybe a year ago. Let me look at the date on this. Yeah, it was October of last year. Sometimes it takes a while for us to take these ideas to take these episodes from idea to implementation, and this is one of those. But we're going to make it happen, so appreciate that. And it's one where you reached out and said, "Hey, I've been listening to the podcast, and I think there's an opportunity for us to talk about cooking wild game, waterfowl from somewhat of a different approach, and maybe from the approach of someone who wasn't professionally trained in the culinary skills." And so one of the first things that we'll do before we get into the actual discussion, and we always do this with our new guests, is to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to our audience. And let's do this kind of from a personal and professional background. Tell us about yourself, JM.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So I grew up on the east coast of Canada, New Brunswick. As you properly drive from my name, French and Dutch background, and my mother would be from the Acadian people in eastern Canada, and we like to consider ourselves as sort of the original Cajuns because a lot of the Cajun descendants and populations actually came from eastern Canada from back in the 1700s. So I love being down in Louisiana and that part of the world, and kind of connecting with those with people with similar backgrounds. But so I grew up in Eastern Canada, moved to the prairies in 2003 to do my grad studies on waterfowl and waterfowl ecology, particularly up in the boreal forest under Bob Clark. And I've always been passionate about waterfowl, and from a young age, even though it wasn't necessarily something that was a tradition within my family, I picked it up, and that passion kind of drove me to moving out here to Saskatchewan. And following grad studies, I bounced around a little bit, went back to the East Coast and did some work there, but felt I needed to be back in Saskatchewan, and so moved back here in 2010 and never looked back. So it's my background professionally is in waterfowl, environmental management stuff. It's something that I'm really passionate about, and as you mentioned, I don't have any formal training in cooking per se, but my love I just love food, and kind of took it from the approach where I had to cook for myself from the age of about 20 when I moved out, and just wanted to explore and see what I could do with that. So
when we talked about this, began preparing for this episode a few days ago, you mentioned the idea of viewing this as sort of a grassroots journey to cooking waterfowl, cooking wild game. And that appeals to me, and I hope it appeals to a lot of our listeners, because that's probably the way most of them have approached it or are trying to approach their experience in learning how to cook wild game, experimenting with new recipes. And so this is an opportunity for us to perhaps accelerate some of their learning, some of what they're doing, give them some different ideas. This is an opportunity to steal some of your thoughts, to steal some of what you've learned over the years, and for people to apply. So to start with, JM, I guess I'll just let you tell the story of the different cultural influences through the years that you have experienced and how those have, quote, flavored the type of recipes that you've tried, the type of recipes that you've come to prefer. Just kind of give us that background on how you went down this road of learning and trying different things, and where you are now with regard to the way you cook your wild game.
Yeah, that's that's a great question, and I like the idea of the grassroots approach to cooking wild game, because unlike some folks that might have the history of waterfowling and cooking waterfowl within their families, and the tradition of passing down some great recipes on how to cook wild game and waterfowl down through the family. I think there's probably quite a few folks like myself that kind of are first generation waterfowlers, really passionate about it, and then they're stuck with, okay, well, how do I make this taste really good? Because growing up, the recipes that we had at home were traditional Acadian recipes, but your average kind of blend of different types of recipes, lasagnas and stuff like that. So I mean, from that perspective, it was always cooked with your standard farm raised meats, and so when I got into more waterfowling and hunting wild game, it really challenged me with how can I take those types of recipes and replace and substitute the farm raised meats with wild meat and maximize kind of those recipes, because I think wild meat and farm raised meat are obviously very different, and it takes a slightly different approach. So getting back to your comment about the side of it really is a chemistry in a sense. You have to look at it from the perspective of what is the right approach to addressing that particular ingredient. And so there's different aspects of flavor, there's different aspects of texture, the structure of it, so the graininess of the meat, the fat content within it. It's all going to be a little bit different, and so you need to kind of look at it from a problem-solving perspective to say, how can I make that really shine, and what's the best approach to it? So,
JM, which of those differences do you consider to be the greatest whenever you talk about, and their implication the greatest, when you talk about the farm-raised, domesticated sources of meat and then wild sources of meat? Of those differences, which is the greatest and has the most impact on the different approaches that a person might take?
Well, from my perspective, I don't know if there is one greatest. I think texture and also the flavors are probably some of the more challenging things to address. And so, from the perspective, I don't know how many of your listeners have ever run across a situation where they're preparing a recipe with duck, and they've got some folks that they're having over for supper, and you mentioned that you're cooking duck for supper, and you'll often get, oh, I love duck, but their version of duck is that farm raised mallard that waddles around and picks up the grain, and so it's generally going to be a slightly different texture, because these aren't birds that are flying around. There's going to be a slightly different flavor based on the food they're eating. So I think there's a little bit of both to overcome. One of the challenges that I think it needs particular attention is the flavor, and the saying "you are what you eat." What you eat is really true, and I mean, part of what I studied was looking at isotopic signatures. So being able to find tracers of the specific foods that individual birds ate, and tracing it back to what proportion of, say, bugs or what proportion of plants and where those foods came from in the individual bird. It rung true that truly is, that saying is very true. You are what you eat. And so you've got some birds that you depending on what they're eating are going to taste very different. And a mallard, for instance, fairly early in the season up here in Canada is going to taste very different from a mallard later on in the season after it's been feeding on grain for a long time, because that bird early on in the season has probably been focusing on bugs to build up that protein. And so, you get a very different flavor profile there, and you might need to address it a little bit differently to make it taste good. So that's a challenge. From the texture perspective, wild meat. I think there's a number of different kind of trains of thought in terms of how to cook wild meat, but for the most part, it's usually about a level of doneness less than you would with farm raised meat. So if you like your steak medium rare, you're probably going to want to cook your wild meat more on the rare side, right? Because it doesn't have that fat content, and so that creates a bit more toughness in the meat. So again, it comes down to personal preferences, which, well, everyone is unique, but those are some general rules of thumb.
As we talk of this as a grassroots journey from your youth into your adulthood, and now where you're investing a little more time in experimenting with additional recipes. You've described to me some of the shows and some of the maybe some of the reference materials that you're using to inform the new ways that you're cooking now. From a journey perspective, what were some of the most popular or most common ways in which you first started cooking wild game, and how did that evolve? What probably grilling, some type of simple grilling technique, but I'm just kind of curious about this literal journey, the simple recipes that you began with, and then how you transitioned to other recipes, types of recipes.
Sure. So I'm gonna kill two birds with one shot, in addressing that question, but also addressing a question I think we might end up on about what's a great recipe to introduce folks to as well, and so getting back to some of the things I first started cooking. I mean, one of my first jobs, like so many people, was working at a McDonald's in New Brunswick, and I remember one of my favorite things to eat there and also to prepare were fajitas. And
At McDonald's?
It was super simple.
Fajitas at McDonald's?
Yeah. Well, New Brunswick anyway.
Okay. I had to make sure I was listening correctly. Sorry to interrupt you there, but I had to,
No worries.
I had to double check.
This was 27 years ago, of course.
Okay.
So
special
but
menu.
It might have been their attempt at diversifying the menu a little bit. But yeah, no, it was a short-term thing that they offered, and it was super simple, super easy. Just grilled meat with seasoning, some cheese, some vegetables, and in a tortilla, and away you go. And when I first started cooking wild game, again, like a lot of my family wasn't used to eating wild meat, and my girlfriend at the time and her family weren't used to eating wild meat, so it was always a challenge trying to find ways to cook this stuff that other people enjoyed and wanted to eat. Right? It wasn't just them being polite and suffering through it. So, and at the same time, going to university, you're always trying to find food and ways to cook stuff that you can pack and take with you, and that are super quick and simple to prepare. And so cooking fajitas was something that I just started trying, and it was great because a lot of the ducks that I was shooting in New Brunswick were not necessarily mallards, a whole bunch of different stuff, including like golden eyes, and I think I might have put a few hooded mergansers into some fajitas and a few other things that some people probably would pass on. But again, I was a new waterfowl hunter, and it was just like every species was new to me, so it seemed pretty cool. And I kind of approached it from the perspective of, I wonder what that tastes like, which I continue to do even today. But taking those birds and then being able to just process them and put them into a recipe that seemed to neutralize any difference in flavor, made everything taste pretty much the same, and still taste really good. And so that was one of the real the trigger point recipes that I thought, what, there's a way to make anything taste good, and it worked, and it just worked. So I mean, that recipe is relatively simple. You just you slice the breasts, and I've even put some thigh meat into them, sautéed with. I like to use about 2/3 chili powder to 1/3 garlic salt blend. Saute the meat and sprinkle that on until they're just cooked. Otherwise, they get a bit tough. You saute some onions and some bell peppers, and then throw it into a tortilla with some grated cheddar. And some people like to add a little bit of salsa or a little bit of sour cream, but you got to eat those right away because it makes things pretty soggy. But the simple 4 ingredients is just fantastic. You can wrap them up in some cellophane and put them in the fridge, and you got some meals to go.
So, JM, I want to ask you a specific question on this because we do fajitas a fair bit at our house, and I don't know that we've ever used waterfowl. We've certainly used venison. And so we talk often about the importance of not overcooking waterfowl or any wild game. So what is the approach that you use here? And I know the way you described it there, where you slice the breast and you cook them, and then you said you cook the vegetables. Is that the order in which you do it? And so then once let me just stop there. Is that the order in which you do it? And then how do you keep from overcooking the breast? Do you take them out of the pan after they're done, and then you combine everything with the seasoning? What's the order of operation here?
Yeah, well, that's a key question, I think, to succeed in recipes that can otherwise fail. And the way I do it is, I've got, if I'm able to, if I'm cooking at home, I've got 2 separate pans. So I've got one for the meat and I've got one for the vegetables. In this recipe, I even separate my onions and my bell peppers because getting back to that, and I'm sure we're going to get to this, but the amount of heat and how long you cook stuff is going to be different for every ingredient. Sometimes you can combine them, but sometimes they need to be separated to really kind of optimize, right? To hit the right amount of doneness or the right approach to cooking. So onions, I like to start them hot and then turn it down so that they basically just brown and caramelize. If I cook my bell peppers the same way as I cook my onions, the bell peppers are going to burn a bit more. And there's a way to do it, and you can get a pretty decent outcome for cooking bell peppers and onions together. But the onions aren't going to be nearly as caramelized, and I find the bell peppers are going to be maybe a little bit overcooked. So I like to separate them if I'm cooking at home, and then I'll have a separate pan for my meat because the meat isn't going to take nearly as long to cook. I'm going to probably cook it a little bit hotter in some butter or some oil, depending on what your preference is. And so I need to separate those because if you just throw everything into the same pan and apply the same, heat and the same amount of time to it, then you'll get food, but it's going to be different.
And then where do the seasonings go? In with the vegetables? You combine all the vegetables kind of at the end? I'm asking you some specific questions because we're kind of laying out a recipe here, and I want people to be able to take something from this.
Yeah, for sure. No, I apply my the seasoning to the meat. So I like to use butter. So I'll cook it in butter, and you've got a little bit of the butter left in the pan as you're sautéing your meat. And I really only cook my meat to sort of a medium rare texture. And then I apply the seasoning after the meat is pretty much cooked. That's when I put the seasoning into the pan. Otherwise, you're going to end up burning the seasoning. And I'll just stir that around, and that seasoning with a little bit of butter, it coats right to your meat. And then what you have is the meat carries that seasoning flavor. And so, especially if you're trying to hide a bit of the flavor, and I've used this recipe to cook common eiders, so sea ducks on the East Coast, and some people can't stand eating them. I absolutely love them, and this is a great recipe for them. So it helps to hide a little bit of that flavor. But then you also have the contrast as you take a bite of that fajita. You have a real clear contrast between the salty, flavorful meat and then the sweetness of the caramelized onions and peppers. And then you've got the texture of your grated cheese. So it's kind of separating those things and then putting them together that really kind of gives you that flavor, that nice kind of sweet and salty flavor profile that just works so well.
So with the fajitas in mind as an easy recipe for introducing people to wild game, waterfowl in this case, where would you go next? Like along your journey, how quickly did you get into more elaborate recipes? Did that take some time? Just kind of take us to the next step or two along your journey. What did you begin to experiment with?
from there, I guess one of the things that I really wanted to try to do was to be able to take wild game, so waterfowl and other things as well, and find a way to convert more of the traditional recipes that I grew up with, to be able to fit those in and to make very similar recipes using wild meat, because there's a comfort to having that, those family recipes or that comfort food that you're so used to. And if you're like me and you feed your family 95% on wild meat and fish, then you got to find a way to make that work. So some of the other recipes that I started to work with and get into were more of the traditional Acadian recipes, and given the holidays coming up, one of the traditional holiday foods that we had in Acadian culture is called tourtière. So it's basically a meat pie. Depending on what part of Eastern Canada you come from, meat pies are made differently. It's kind of like barbecue down in the U.S. It depends if you're in Texas or Louisiana or on the East Coast, and everyone's got their own way of making barbecue, but everyone on the East Coast of Canada has a different way of making their tourtière or meat pie. And the way my mother always did it was, with either turkey or chicken or sometimes pork, but mixed with potatoes, mashed potatoes, some seasoning, some onions, and then basically put it in a pie shell and baked. And so, it was something that I always really loved at Christmas time growing up. So I wanted to try to figure out how to do that with wild game, and particularly waterfowl. And I found that it's pretty easy to do, but again, because waterfowl tend to have a slightly stronger flavor than your traditional white meats like turkey, chicken, and pork. Putting it in with a bunch of potatoes, well, you're going to really taste the wild meat flavor in it. So I started looking at, okay, well, what else can I pair it with that'll complement that meat, but that doesn't easily get overpowered? And so I started looking at using a little bit of rutabaga and turnip and putting in some carrots and different types of onions and stuff in there. And so that mix, so that combination actually turned out to be really nice because the flavors were really complementary. And so developed a way to go about that recipe, but using wild meat.
JM, is that because the flavors of the rutabagas and the turnips, is that more robust flavor and it pairs well with the stronger, sometimes stronger flavor of the waterfowl?
Yeah, exactly, right. So I mean, it's kind of like when you're pairing a wine with your meal, right? White wines tend to go with seafood, and white meats, because their flavor, there's nice flavors, but it's not nearly as strong as a red meat, which is better off with a red wine. So the robustness of what you're pairing, it needs to balance, or else you're going to end up with just one dominant flavor, and you're not going to get anything from the rest of it. And so, yeah, the rutabaga, which I prefer myself over turnip, but rutabagas have a similar kind of texture to potato, but they've got a lot more robustness to the flavor, which can pair well with the wild game flavors.
Now, you mentioned kind of holiday season and how wild game, that there was a recipe for wild game, or I guess a traditional holiday recipe for your family, and then you adapted it so that you could use wild game in it. How prominent is wild game at your holiday table, whether we're talking about Thanksgiving or Christmas or any other kind of holiday?
It's absolutely dominant at our table. I mean, even at Thanksgiving, which for those listeners that aren't aware, Canadian Thanksgiving is usually the second week in October, unlike yours, which is later in November. And so, second weekend of October up here coincides really well with sort of our waterfowl season and goose hunting. And so, a nice plucked, roasted Canada goose for Thanksgiving dinner, or white front if we're lucky to get one that that's worthy of roasting is usually our go-to. So around the holidays, yeah, it's wild meat, but it's also wild meat most of the time through the year anyway.
JM, as we talked about the fajita recipe, you mentioned that the part of the duck that's involved in that is the breast. There's obviously more meat on a duck than that, especially when you roast a duck, you get the meat from the entire roasted carcass. But increasingly, you're seeing some recipes out there that involve the use of legs of the ducks or geese that we harvest. What's your favorite way to prepare those? I know you've told me about this before, that you like them. They're in some of your favorite cuts of meat from a duck or a goose, but what's your favorite way of preparing that?
I have to say, I mean, shout out to my youngest son, Sebastian. His favorite part of a goose is definitely the legs. And you're right. I mean, roasting a bird is you get everything, and you can even take the rest of the carcass and turn it into a soup if you want afterwards. But I like to take the legs of my geese, cranes, and ducks. A little harder with your teal because they're somewhat small, but they're still equally applicable. But I like to put them in a slow cooker, and I'll add some water, some sliced onions, a little summer savory, some salt, some pepper, and some bouillon or broth of some kind, and just cover them up in that, and put them on low for 7-8 hours. And the key with the legs, though, is especially when it comes to ducks and geese or waterfowl or wild birds in general, is how long you cook them. And you need to cross that threshold. I've tried it where, I've been in a rush and I've thrown it in, and, I've cooked them for 5 hours and came back and then sat down for supper, and they are as tough as nails. And fastest way to turn off anyone to eating legs is to undercook them. But once you cross that 6-7 hours, and it depends on individual slow cookers, but once you cross the 6-7 hours, they just fall off the bone. They are so tender and absolutely fantastic.
JM, I've encountered that same issue. I don't know that it's necessarily been with duck or goose legs, where I thought I started the slow cooker early enough, but it turns out I didn't. What has been your experience in the ability to speed that up? Like if you get to that 5-hour mark and you go try them and they're still tough as nails, can you increase the heat and maybe speed that up, or is that ruining the whole thing? What do you know, and what's been your experience there?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I haven't yet found a way around that. To be honest, when Scott Stevens was over this fall, and we did a little bit of crane hunting, and I threw some crane thighs in the slow cooker, and I thought I'd cooked them long enough, and I was trying a new recipe, and well, they were tough, embarrassingly so, actually, and I've tried that same approach. I was making kind of a honey curry. Crane thighs, and I've tried it since and cooked it a little bit longer, and it worked. And I've tried the approach of speeding it up by making it hotter, but that's the problem with wild meat, is that you just don't have as much fat content, and I don't find that it can really take the heat for longer because it dries it out. And so that's been my experience. Again, I'm no professional, but if someone writes in the comments that they've got a way around it, I'd love to hear it.
So I guess one piece of advice, though, would be, and I've tried to employ this, if I think it's going to take 6 hours, I start it at least 7 hours in advance. And if it is done prior to that 7-hour mark, I can always turn the heat down and keep it at a real low temperature without drying it out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I guess that's a much better approach to taking it, because there's the fail-safe that if you do need more time, you can make it happen. But if you were trying to make a 7-hour recipe and you only had a 5-hour window, yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Let me ask you a question here to begin our closeout. There's a much more distance on your journey than what we'll be able to cover today. So that just means we're going to have to bring you back to cover some additional recipes and additional stops along your journey. For today, though, for our listeners that may be on this journey and trying new things, trying to improve their culinary skill when it comes to wild game, and I certainly encourage that, because wild game, when prepared well, correctly, using good recipes, using good techniques, rivals and exceeds the flavor profile and the experience and the rewards of anything that you can buy at a grocery store. And just the entire experience from the harvesting, from doing what it takes to harvest the animal, the harvest itself, preparing, storing, saving, and then the preparation of the recipe. I mean, that entire cycle brings something different that you can't get from the purchase, from simply purchasing meat from the grocery store. So I wholeheartedly encourage people to go down their own journey, and hopefully this conversation will help you along that way, speed that up. And so in that vein, JM, what are some important reference manuals, I say manuals, but books, cookbooks or recipe books, or any kind of other materials that may be out there today that you have found particularly helpful and that our listeners may benefit from?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. And to be honest, I see it more and more where, there's a huge market now for microbrew beers, right? The variety and the differences of things that we can eat and that we can consume. People are looking for variety. People are looking for things that are different. And so I agree with you. I wholeheartedly encourage everyone to go out and to try, eating wild meat and cooking it too. It's absolutely fantastic. And that's the thing I love the most is, we can all go out and buy chicken and beef and pork and whatnot, and sometimes, I absolutely love throwing some ribs on the barbecue, but to be able to add to that all the diversity of wild meat is just fantastic. So, but to get to your question, which is a really good one, there's a lot of great resources out there for cooking wild meat. I mean, some of the ones that I would probably recommend to someone that's really new. There's some new books by Stephen Rennell on cooking wild game, which is fantastic. I really like the series by Hank Shaw. There's one, Duck Duck Goose, that's devoted to waterfowl, and I think the recipes in there are fantastic. So I've used those as ways to get some ideas on how to go about cooking wild game. One of the things that I really like to do is, when I go to a restaurant and I'm looking at the menu for something that's unique or different that I've never tried, I look at it and I kind of think, okay, well, how can I apply that? Or how can I apply wild game to this recipe as a substitute and see how I could make it work too? So there's lots of ways that we can find, inspiration to be creative. On the fundamental side, I recently watched a series on Netflix, and there's a similar book called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, and it's really unique because it kind of just boils down cooking to its fundamentals and the fundamental approaches and principles that make for good food. And my initial thought about the title and the principles is that the one I think is really missing that's fundamental to cooking wild game is time. So I would add that it's salt, fat, acid, heat, and time. And it kind of gets back to that question you had about the legs, where you can cook turkey legs pretty quickly, but a goose leg's going to take you twice as long. Same temperature, same everything else, but it's time is the variable that you need to adjust.
So those are some fantastic references that you mentioned there. I have a couple of those. I have not watched the series that you talked about there at the end. I'll certainly have to do that. What other kind of concluding piece of advice would you provide to our listeners that are wanting to get better at cooking wild game and introducing other folks to it as well?
Well, I guess the only advice that I would give anyone is just to give it a shot, right? I mean, one of the inspirational comments my father gave me as I started to explore this was that, the culinary arts, which really are a form of art, are unique where, if you mess it up, it's gone an hour later, right? And you get to start over the next day. So, unlike a mural on the side of a building, if you mess up a recipe, well, so be it. You get to try it differently tomorrow. So just get out there and give it a try and see what you can do and share it too.
Yeah, that last part is a great thing to add. Thank you for doing so. JM, I'll also thank you for your time here today. I've enjoyed this a great deal, and I hope our listeners do too. The way we thought about this, a grassroots journey to becoming a a better cook, a more experienced, a more skilled cook of wild game, I think will probably resonate with many people. And because of all the references that are out there today, I think a lot of this it probably feels a bit more accessible to folks, and that's a good thing. We have a lot of other questions that we could ask you and that we'll want to talk to you about at some point in the future. I know you've shared some ideas about what else we could talk about, some of the underutilized parts of ducks and geese and other species of birds. Why do we see differences in the flavor profile across different species of waterfowl, and then beyond waterfowl as well? Even when we talk about some of the short distance flyers, some of the non-migrant birds, such as our upland game birds, the light meat versus dark meat, the sort of scientific, physiological basis behind some of those differences. I think our audience would appreciate learning about that. And then just some other recipes, perhaps some more sophisticated, involved recipes, and then side items. I asked you that question when we were preparing for this, like how much time do you invest in sides versus the main course? So a lot of different information that we can bring, a lot of additional information that we can bring to this. And so I hope you'll be willing to come back and join us and do so.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Well, thank you, JM, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Michel DeVink, Ducks Unlimited Canada's Manager of National Conservation Planning, and also, as he's demonstrated here, a very skilled amateur chef, you might even say. We appreciate his time and sharing a lot of the things that he's learned on his journey. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the wonderful job that he does with these episodes. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and spending with us and for your support and passion for wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.